The cruiser's spotlight hit her side mirror first. Camille Dupree felt it before she registered what it was, that sudden white intrusion bending across the dashboard, washing out the amber glow of the console, making everything in the car look clinical, like the inside of an X-ray machine. She was on Parish Road 14 heading south, still 12 minutes from home, and for a moment she did what most people do when the light comes. She checked the speedometer and tried to remember if she'd rolled that stop sign at the corner of Terrebonne and Vine. She knew she hadn't. She pulled to the gravel shoulder anyway. It was 11:22 on a Wednesday in late October. The air coming through her cracked window smelled like standing water and cut cane, which it always did out here in this part of St. Mary Parish when the harvest was winding down. The sugar mill 4 miles east was still running second shift, and if the wind was right you could smell the molasses working sweet and almost rot, the way overripe things get. She kept her hands on the wheel at 10 and 2. She turned the radio off. She didn't reach for her purse. The footsteps on the gravel were slow and deliberate. A flashlight swept through the back window. She heard him before he spoke. A certain kind of man walks like he's checking something off a list, each step a decision. She had been a legal assistant at Tirode and Fontenot for 6 years, and she had seen enough depositions, enough transcripts, enough incident reports typed in passive voice, to know the difference between a cop who pulled you over because you had a brake light out and a cop who pulled you over because he decided to. License and registration. He was already at her window. She hadn't heard him come that far. She turned her head and found herself looking at a badge before she found a face. Sergeant, the nameplate below the star read Pruett. Sure, she said. Her voice was steady. She was aware of it being steady, which meant she was working at it. They're in my glove box. Is it okay if I reach for them? Go ahead. She opened the glove box slowly, found the registration, opened her wallet with the same unhurried care. She held both out the window between 2 fingers. He took them without looking at her. He walked back to the cruiser. She watched him in the mirror. He sat there longer than it takes to run a plate. The cane field to her right made a dry, papery sound in the wind. Somewhere behind the tree line, a dog was barking. Dale Pruett had been with the St. Mary Parish Sheriff's Office for 19 years. He'd made sergeant in his 11th year, which wasn't especially fast but wasn't slow either, and he'd stayed sergeant since, which some people read as contentment and other people read as ceiling. He was 46 years old. He had a daughter in Baton Rouge he spoke to twice a month and an ex-wife who had remarried a man who sold irrigation equipment in Shreveport. He lived alone in a 2-bedroom house in Barrack, kept it reasonably clean, had a standing poker game on Thursdays with 4 other guys from the department. He coached youth football for 3 years in the early 2000s, and people in town still mentioned it like it was recent. He wasn't a bad person in any way that he could articulate. He had worked hard and done his job, and the job was harder than most people understood, and that was something he thought about often, how nobody understood. The calls at 2 a.m., the domestics where you show up and the woman whose face is swollen shut won't say who did it because she's more afraid of what happens after you leave than what's happening now. The traffic stops that went wrong in a half second. The paperwork. The way you're supposed to have a reason for everything when most of the time it was pattern recognition, instinct, the thing you couldn't put in a report because reports had to be in declarative sentences with observable facts. He had learned over 19 years that you could make the facts fit the instinct if you were careful. The woman in the silver Camry had a clean record, no priors, the registration was current, insurance was current. The address on her license matched the vehicle registration rural route outside of Charenton, which was about 12 miles south of where she was right now, which tracked for the time of night. He had pulled her over because she'd been on this road before, twice in the last 2 weeks, both times around this hour, and both times she'd been driving with the careful, deliberate slowness of someone who didn't want to be noticed. He'd watched her from the shell road that ran beside the old Melanchon property, watched her headlights come south, slow, and then continue. He had a theory about the Melanchon property. The theory had been building for 3 months. He had not filed anything with his lieutenant yet because he didn't have enough, and because his lieutenant was the kind of man who needed everything handed to him in a box with a ribbon. He got out of the cruiser. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step out of the vehicle." Camille looked at him. "Can I ask why?" "I'm detecting an odor," he said it flatly. "The way you say something you've decided is already true." She didn't answer right away. She turned and looked straight out through the windshield for a moment. The road ahead was empty and dark, the headlights cutting out about 40 yards before the tree lines swallowed them. Then she reached into her jacket pocket and came out with her phone. "I'm going to record this interaction," she said. "That's my right." Something shifted in his face. It wasn't anger exactly. It was more like recalibration, the look of a man who'd been handed an unexpected variable and was already working out what to do about it. "You can record whatever you want," he said. "Step out of the vehicle." She got out. She was wearing dark slacks and a cream-colored blouse under a charcoal blazer. She'd been at a deposition in Morgan City until 7 that evening, a wrongful termination case that was going to settle for somewhere between $40,000 and $60,000, and she'd driven the long way home because she always did when she needed to think. She stood on the gravel shoulder with the phone held at her side, camera facing out. "Hand me the phone," Pruett said. "I'd rather not do that." "Ma'am." "My name is Camille Dupree. I'm a legal assistant. I know I don't have to hand you my phone during a stop unless you have a warrant or you're arresting me, and if you are arresting me, I'd like to know what the charge is." She wasn't shaking. He noticed that. Most people, even people who knew their rights in the abstract, started shaking when it got real. Hands voiced something. She had her weight evenly distributed and her eyes were watching his hands, not his face. That was training, or something that functioned like training. People who watched your face were watching for mood. People who watched your hands were watching for what was going to happen. "I'd like you to walk to the rear of the vehicle," he said. She walked to the rear of the vehicle. He followed. He told her he was going to conduct a search based on the odor he had detected. He told her she could refuse, but that refusal would be noted and he would seek a warrant if necessary. She said she did not consent to a search, but that she was not going to physically interfere with him. She said this the way someone reads from a card, not panicked, not angry, just precise. He noticed she was still holding the phone, and he noticed that she had maneuvered herself during the walk to the rear of the car so that the phone was still pointing at him. He was aware of what the phone could do. He was also aware of where he was, Parish Road 14 at 11:22 at night, no other cars in either direction, no houses with sight lines to this stretch. He took the phone. "You are obstructing." "I need this as evidence," he said. He held it, thumb finding the button on the side. She was watching his hands again. "That's my property. Taking my phone is. It's being secured pending investigation." He pocketed it. He turned to her car. What happened in the next 4 minutes was methodical and practiced. He opened the back door on the driver's side. He looked under the seats. He opened the trunk, moved a gym bag, moved a cardboard box of files, and then he paused there with his back to her long enough that she couldn't see exactly what his hands were doing. When he turned around, he was holding a freezer bag. Inside the bag was a compressed brick of something dark and dense. "Ma'am," he said, "I'm going to need you to place your hands behind your back." At 11:19 p.m., 3 minutes before Dale Pruett activated his light bar, a Cessna 182 Skylane was banking into a slow orbit at 2,100 feet above the Atchafalaya Basin corridor, roughly 4 miles northeast of Parish Road 14. The plane had been flying the same orbit, more or less, 4 nights a week for 11 weeks. It was registered to a flight school in Baton Rouge, which was a functional registration with an additional layer of documentation that didn't appear in public FAA databases. The 2 men inside, one flying, one managing a sensor package that was bolted to the belly of the aircraft, were employees of the Federal Bureau of Investigation's New Orleans field office. Their operation had a case number but no catchy name. What they were looking at, primarily, was a piece of farm property 6 miles south of Camille Dupree's car that had, over the past 3 months, received a pattern of nighttime vehicle traffic inconsistent with any legitimate agricultural operation. The sensor package included a FLIR Star SAFIRE HD forward-looking infrared camera and a high-resolution daylight camera that was, in the dark, still pulling in enough ambient light to produce usable footage. The system was not classified. It was commercially available equipment used by law enforcement agencies across the country, and the legal authority for its use, flying over an area without a warrant, capturing images of what occurred in open view, had been established by the Supreme Court in a line of cases going back to the 1980s. The FBI's lawyers had blessed the operation at every stage. It had been logged and documented, and the U.S. Attorney's Office in New Orleans had been briefed. The man running the sensors was named Terrence Welch. He was 33 years old, a former Marine with a background in ISR intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance. He had been doing this work for the Bureau for 4 years. On most nights the footage was unremarkable, truck headlights on farm roads, nothing that rose to the level of action. He logged it, tagged it, and moved on. At 11:19 the camera was pointed slightly southwest, tracking a vehicle that had come off the main highway and turned onto a gravel road near the Melanchthon property. When the vehicle stopped at the edge of a cane field and sat there for 4 minutes with its lights off and then turned around, Welch tagged the timestamp and made a note. He had seen this before. He was beginning to understand the pattern. At 11:22 he noticed at the upper edge of the frame a set of flashing lights on what his GPS overlay told him was Parish Road 14. He zoomed. The booking room at the St. Mary Parish Jail in Centerville smelled like industrial cleaner and old coffee. The overhead fluorescence had that particular flicker that wasn't quite visible. You couldn't catch it directly, but after 20 minutes it gave you a headache above your left eye like a thumbnail pressing in. Camille sat in a plastic chair bolted to the floor and watched a deputy she didn't know type her information into a form. She had said nothing since the car. She had been handcuffed, patted down, seated in the back of Pruett's cruiser and transported here in 23 minutes. During the ride she had looked out the window and watched the dark fields pass, and thought about what she knew and what she could prove, and what the next 12 hours would look like. She thought about the phone, which was in Pruett's possession and which had recorded approximately 4 minutes of audio and partial video before he took it. She thought about whether the recording had been deleted or just pocketed. She thought about her employer, whose personal cell number she had memorized, and about whether this was a situation where she called him tonight or waited until morning. She decided tonight. They let her make a call at 12:47 a.m. She called Bernard Tirode. He answered on the third ring, which meant he'd been close to awake. "It's Camille," she said. "I need you to know where I am. I don't need you to come tonight, I need you to know." She told him. She gave him the charges as they'd been read to her: possession of a controlled dangerous substance with intent to distribute, Schedule II, approximately 400 grams. She told him about the stop. She told him about the phone. She told him about the bag Pruett had held up. There was a silence on the line. "You said you never consented to the search," Bernard said. "That's correct." "You said it out loud or you thought it?" "I said it out loud. I also told him I was recording." Another silence. "Camille, where exactly on 14 were you?" She told him the approximate location, between the old gravel plant and the Melanchthon place. Bernard Tirode was 61 years old. He had been practicing civil and criminal law in this parish for 32 years. He had a manner that people sometimes mistook for slowness because he never hurried, never raised his voice, never performed urgency. Camille had worked for him long enough to recognize that what looked like slowness was actually the opposite. He was thinking 2 or 3 steps ahead of wherever the conversation was, and what looked like stillness was him choosing his pace deliberately. "Get some sleep if you can," he said. "I'll be there at 8. Dale Pruett got home at 2:15 a.m. He made himself a glass of ice water and sat at the kitchen table without turning on a light. He had done paperwork at the jail. He had submitted the evidence, the bag with the substance, into chain of custody with the night sergeant, a man named Falgout who had signed the form without comment. He had written his incident report on the cruiser's laptop before driving back. The report described detecting an odor of marijuana upon approaching the vehicle, a statement by the driver that she was not consenting to a search, and his determination that probable cause existed based on the odor, at which point he conducted the search and located the substance. The thing about the odor was that it was not provable or disprovable. You either smelled something or you didn't. Courts had gone back and forth on it since the drug dog cases, but for a roadside stop in Louisiana in the middle of the night, an officer's statement that he detected an odor remained sufficient to establish probable cause in most trial courts, and he knew it. The woman had been calm. Too calm, maybe, in a way that he found unsettling, not because calmness was suspicious, but because her calmness had the specific quality of someone who had thought through this exact scenario, not someone caught off guard. Someone who knew where the edges were. He had gone over the phone after he'd returned to the cruiser, found the recording app, stopped the recording, looked at what she'd captured, about 90 seconds of video that was mostly dark with some audio, his voice, her voice, the ambient sound of the road. The video quality was poor, the audio was cleaner. He had deleted it. There was no statute that specifically prohibited a Louisiana sheriff's deputy from handling a phone secured during a traffic stop. The law around that was still being litigated in various courts, and he knew enough to know it was murky. He felt reasonably certain that the deletion would be characterized as evidence preservation or as a procedural issue rather than a crime. He had been wrong about legal questions before, but not often enough to change his habits. He sat in the dark and drank his water and did not feel particularly troubled. He felt the low-grade residual tension that always followed a shift that hadn't gone exactly to the script, but it wasn't the tension of doubt. It was more like the feeling after a difficult play in football, a scramble, not the designed play but you'd gotten the yards. He thought about the Melanchon property, about the pattern he'd been building for 3 months, about the woman who kept driving past. He was almost certain she was a courier. He was almost certain she'd made a drop that night before he pulled her over, which was why he'd found nothing in the car except what he'd brought. He had convinced himself of this so thoroughly that it had stopped feeling like a theory. Terrence Welch flagged the footage at 6:45 a.m. the following morning, when he was back at the New Orleans field office reviewing the previous night's recordings on a workstation in a windowless room on the 4th floor. He watched the segment twice, then called his supervisor. Special Agent in Charge Patricia Mouton came into the room, set a paper cup of coffee on the desk beside him, and watched the monitor over his shoulder. The footage showed a stretch of road. It showed a vehicle on the shoulder with emergency lights. It showed a figure, the officer, at the back of the stopped vehicle. The infrared image was clear enough that you could see the heat signatures with reasonable precision. The officer's body, the open trunk, the other figure standing several feet away. You could see the officer's arm moving in the trunk. You could see in the daylight-augmented camera track the officer turn, close the trunk, and move toward the standing figure. You could see his arm come forward. You could see something in his hand. Patricia Mouton had been with the Bureau for 22 years. She had worked public corruption cases for 9 of them. She did not say anything for almost 2 minutes. "What do we know about the stop?" she said finally. "I ran the plate on the cruiser this morning, St. Mary Parish Sheriff's Office, assigned to Sergeant Dale Pruett, badge 1144. He's been there 19 years. The victim's car registered to a Camille Dupree address in Charenton. I pulled the jail log. She was booked last night on a possession charge." He paused. "Pruett's charge." Mouton picked up her coffee but didn't drink it. "Get the stop report, get the evidence log, see if there's body cam." She set the coffee down. "And I want to know what she does for work." Bernard Turod arrived at the St. Mary Parish Jail at 8:07. He was dressed in a gray suit, which he wore 3 days a week regardless of what was on the calendar, and he carried a slim leather portfolio and nothing else. He requested a meeting with his client in the attorney consultation room and was made to wait 11 minutes, which he spent standing, not sitting, in a way that managed to communicate patience and impatience simultaneously. Camille came in looking like someone who had not slept but had decided not to show it. She sat across from him. She told him everything in order without embellishment. She told him about the stop's location and the time. She told him what Pruett had said and what she had said. She told him about the recording. She described the sequence at the trunk precisely, Pruett's back to her, the duration, the emergence of the bag. "The bag," Bernard said. "Had you ever seen it before?" "No." "Was anything in your trunk that it could have been confused with?" "A gym bag and a box of case files. Neither of those are a freezer bag." "The substance?" "I don't know what's in it," she said. I don't carry." He made a note. He made notes the way he talked, economically, with long pauses between them. "The phone." "He pocketed it. I watched him do it. He told me it was being secured as evidence. If the video was deleted, it may not matter. Metadata might survive. If it was synced to a cloud account before he deleted it. It wasn't. I don't use auto sync. I turned it off 2 years ago because of a client confidentiality issue." He nodded. "I'm going to seek a bond hearing for this afternoon. I don't want you in here more than 24 hours. He paused. "Is there anyone else who knows this road? Anyone who saw you there before who'd know you used that route?" She thought about it. "I've gotten gas at the Chevron in Centerville maybe twice in the past month coming south on 14. The same woman was working both times. I don't know her name. He wrote something? I'm also going to make some calls this morning. I want to talk to some people. He didn't say who. She had learned in 6 years not to ask him questions whose answers he'd already decided she didn't need yet. She folded her hands on the table. She was aware of the bruise forming on her right wrist where the cuff had been too tight, and she'd held her arm at an awkward angle for the entire 23-minute drive. Bernard, she said. He looked up. He put it in there. I need you to believe that's what happened, not because I'm your paralegal and you're obligated, but because it's the truth. He held her gaze. I've been in this parish for 32 years, he said. I believe you. The bond hearing was at 3:45 that afternoon in front of Judge Marietta Blanchard, who had been on the bench for 14 years and who ran her courtroom with the focused disinterest of someone who had heard every variation of every story at least twice. Bernard argued that his client had no criminal record, strong community ties, was employed, and posed no flight risk. The ADA, a young man named Hebert who seemed underslept and slightly uncertain of which file was which, did not oppose strenuously. Bond was set at $12,000, 10%. Camille was out by 6. She sat in Bernard's car in the parking lot for a moment before she got out. The late afternoon light was flat and silver, the kind that makes everything look slightly overexposed. Across the lot, a woman was loading groceries into an SUV. A man in a Saints cap was talking on his phone. An ordinary October evening in a place where nothing unusual had happened. Go home, Bernard said. Don't talk to anyone about this except me and your family. Don't post anything. Don't call anyone from the department. Don't reach out to Pruett. Don't acknowledge him if you see him. Don't engage. I know, she said. I know you know. He looked out the windshield. Someone reached out to me this morning. I wasn't going to mention it today, but someone from the U.S. Attorney's Office in New Orleans made some preliminary inquiries about your case. She looked at him. I don't know the shape of it yet, he said. Just don't be surprised if things move in ways that don't look like what you'd expect. What Camille did not know, and what Bernard only partially knew, was that Patricia Mouton had spent most of that Thursday on the phone. She had spoken to 2 prosecutors in the U.S. Attorney's Office. She had spoken to her own supervisor in Washington, who had told her to proceed carefully but to proceed. She had requested a complete review of Dale Pruett's service record through a back-channel inquiry that would not appear in any official request logs accessible to the St. Mary Parish Sheriff's Office. She had also sent an agent, a junior agent named Devereaux, who was from the area originally and could pass for a civilian without difficulty, to drive Parish Road 14 in a personal vehicle at various hours and observe. What the service record showed, Dale Pruett had been named in 6 internal affairs inquiries over 19 years. 5 had been closed without findings. 1, a 2017 allegation involving a search and seizure during a traffic stop, had resulted in a 3-day suspension that was subsequently reduced to a written reprimand. The allegation in 2017 had come from a man named Cortez Thibodeaux, who had claimed that a controlled substance found in his truck had been placed there. The internal investigation had concluded that there was insufficient evidence to support the allegation. Cortez Thibodeaux had served 14 months at Elaine Hunt Correctional. The aerial footage from the night of the Camille Dupree stop had been reviewed by 3 people at the Bureau and had been sent, with chain of custody documentation, to a forensic imaging unit in Quantico. The unit's preliminary assessment, received Friday morning, 18 hours after the stop, was that the footage showed, with a high degree of clarity, a figure at the rear of a stopped vehicle appearing to place an object into the trunk of that vehicle before producing the object for display to a second figure standing nearby. The forensic assessor had written in the dry language of the field, the motion pattern of the primary subject's right arm during the period of 23:22:04 through 23:22:19 is consistent with concealment of an object within the compartment, rather than retrieval of an object from the compartment. In regular language, he put it in, then pretended to find it. Pruett got the call on a Friday morning while he was in the shift briefing room, waiting for the 7 a.m. roll call that his lieutenant was running 6 minutes late for, which was normal. His cell buzzed in his pocket. He looked at it. The number was his union rep, Chauvin, who usually texted rather than called. He stepped into the hallway. Dale, Chauvin's voice had a quality Pruett recognized from depositions, that careful, we're being recorded flatness. I need you to come by my office today, not tomorrow, today. I'm on shift until 3. After 3 then, but today, a pause. There are some inquiries being made that I need to brief you on. Pruett leaned against the cinderblock wall. The hallway smelled like floor wax. Someone's radio was squawking at the far end. What kind of inquiries? The kind I'd rather talk about in person. He stood there after the call ended. He thought about Camille Dupree. He thought about the booking, the evidence log, the report he had filed. He thought about the phone and what he had done with the phone. He'd cleared it and left it in the property room with a note that it had been secured as evidence related to the stop. He had not thrown it away. He had been careful. He went back into the briefing room. His lieutenant was talking about a series of thefts from farm equipment dealers in the western part of the parish. Pruett sat and listened and took no notes. He was not particularly worried. The feeling that moved through him was more like a low vibration, the feeling of driving over a road where the concrete sections have small gaps, that regular, rhythmic jolt that you got used to. He had been making judgment calls for 19 years. He had been questioned about them and he had explained them, and the explanations had held. The system, he understood, was not perfectly adversarial to men like him. It had evolved alongside men like him in certain ways, and it knew how to make room for ambiguity. He spent his shift on the north end of the parish. He wrote 2 speeding citations. He responded to a fender bender on Highway 90. He ate lunch at a gas station, a boudin link and a bag of chips, standing outside in the thin autumn sunlight watching the cars on the highway pass. The U.S. Attorney's Office filed the complaint on a Tuesday morning, 11 days after the stop. It did not go to the St. Mary Parish Sheriff's Office first. It did not pass through any local channel. It was filed directly in Federal District Court in New Orleans under seal, which meant Dale Pruett was at work sitting at his desk at 9:45 a.m., writing a supplemental report on a completely unrelated matter, when 4 people walked into the St. Mary Parish Sheriff's Office and asked to speak with the sheriff. 2 of them were FBI agents. 1 was an AUSA. The 4th was a woman from the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division whose name Pruett would not learn until later. The sheriff's name was Beaumont Arsenault, 63 years old, 4 terms, a man who had survived in this parish by understanding when something was bigger than him. He understood it within the first 90 seconds of the meeting. He asked his admin assistant to hold his calls. Pruett was called in at 10:20. He walked in and found 4 people he didn't know sitting in chairs that had been arranged in a way that left him with one option, the chair facing all of them with his back to the door. He sat. He looked at the woman with the DOJ credentials. She looked back at him without expression. The FBI agent on the left, a compact man with close-cut gray hair, maybe 50, named Garber, placed a printed photograph on the table in front of Pruett. It was a still frame from aerial footage. Infrared. Parish Road 14 was visible at the bottom of the frame. The cruiser's emergency lights showed as bright blooms. The trunk of the stopped vehicle was open. A figure that was clearly a person stood at the trunk, facing away. Garber placed a second photograph beside it, the same scene 3 seconds later by the timestamp. The figure's right arm was extended into the trunk. A third photograph. The figure turned toward the camera, and though the face was not identifiable in infrared, the badge on the chest was a heat signature, white and clear. A fourth photograph. The figure facing the second person, arm extended forward, object in hand. Pruett looked at the photographs for a long time. He was aware that the room was very quiet. He could hear the HVAC. He could hear a phone ringing somewhere in the building, far away. "I want to speak with my attorney," he said. "Absolutely," Garber said. He pulled a card from his pocket and set it on the table. "That's the number for the Federal Public Defender's Office if you need it. You are not under arrest at this time. That may change." He paused. "We're going to be here for a while regardless." Pruett picked up the card. He did not look at the photographs again. The days between the filing and the arrest had their own specific texture. Camille went to work. She went through depositions and file requests and phone calls and the ordinary architecture of a day at Parish Road and Fontenot, and people who didn't know what was happening looked at her and saw nothing out of the ordinary, which was deliberate. The two attorneys in the office who knew Bernard and his partner, a woman named Yvette Savy who handled most of their criminal defense work, were careful not to treat her differently. She appreciated this more than she could say. She drove a different route home, not out of fear, exactly. Out of a practical recognition that Parish Road 14 at 11 p.m. was not a good idea in the current circumstance. She slept poorly, not because of nightmares or anxiety spirals but because her body would simply arrive at 3 a.m. and stop, and she'd lie there cataloging things, the sequence at the trunk, the weight of the cuffs, the fluorescent flicker of the booking room, the specific way Pruett had said I'm detecting an odor with the practiced casualness of a man reciting a line he'd used before. She thought about Cortez Thibodeaux, whose name she'd learned from Bernard 3 days after her release, 14 months. She thought about what 14 months looked like from the inside. She did not feel heroic. She felt like a person who had been on a particular road at a particular time and whose ordinary careful habits, statting things out loud, keeping her hands visible, knowing her rights, had intersected with something much larger than herself. She had a conversation with her mother that she would think about for a long time afterward. Her mother, Ida, who was 71 and lived in Lafayette and had worked as a school nurse for 34 years, listened to the whole story and then was quiet for a moment and then said, "You know what I'm going to tell you?" And Camille said, "I know, Mama," and Ida said, "That's all I'm going to say then." What Ida was going to say was a thing they'd been saying to each other in various forms since Camille was about 9 years old. It was not a political statement or a call to action. It was more like weather knowledge, the understanding that certain conditions existed and that you navigated them with whatever you had. It was not acceptance, it was just knowing. Dale Pruett was arrested on a Thursday morning. He was at home when they came. He had known since the meeting in the sheriff's office that it was coming, and he had retained a private attorney named Melanchon, no relation to the property, who had met with him twice and reviewed the situation and told him with the careful plainness of a man who respected both his client and the truth, that the evidentiary situation was serious. The aerial footage alone, Melanchon told him, was going to be very difficult to argue against, because it was government footage captured in the course of a separate authorized operation. It had no chain of custody issues, and it had been reviewed by a forensic imaging expert whose credentials were, frankly, bulletproof. There were 4 agents at his door. He had seen the movies where they sent 12 battering rams tactical vests shouting. This was nothing like that. There was a woman agent who told him quietly that she had a warrant for his arrest and that he was being charged with deprivation of rights under color of law, in violation of Title 18 U.S.C. Section 242, evidence tampering and obstruction of justice. She read him his rights in a tone that was almost conversational. She asked if he'd like to put on shoes. He was in socks. He put on shoes. He took his jacket from the hook by the door. He did not look back at the interior of the house as he walked out. The morning was clear. The light was sharp and thin, the way October mornings are in South Louisiana, bright but without warmth, the sky a hard blue. His neighbor, a retired teacher named Fontenot, was getting his newspaper from the end of the driveway and looked up as Pruett was walked to the car. Neither of them said anything. Pruett got into the back seat. He looked at his hands in his lap. He was not thinking about the photographs. He was not thinking about what he would say at arraignment. He was thinking about a specific afternoon in October about 12 years ago when he had coached a youth football game and one of his players, a kid named Marcus, 10 years old, small for his age, who ran routes with a kind of terrified determination that Pruett had genuinely admired, had caught a pass in the corner of the end zone to win the game. The kid had looked back at him with a face that was pure, uncomplicated joy, and Pruett had jogged onto the field and put a hand on his shoulder and said, "That's what I'm talking about," and the kid had laughed. He didn't know why that was what came to him. He wasn't a particularly self-reflective man. He hadn't constructed any theory of where things had gone wrong or what arc his life traced. He just sat in the back of the car and that image was there and the morning moved past the windows. The federal arraignment was in New Orleans in the Hale Boggs Federal Building on Camp Street. Pruett was released on his own recognizance, a function of his 19-year employment record and the fact that no one assessed him as a flight risk, with conditions that included surrendering his badge and weapon, which the St. Mary Parish Sheriff had already requested the previous week. The case was assigned to Judge Helen Tran, a Clinton appointee who was now in her late 60s and who had a reputation for running an exceedingly clean courtroom. She was not known for dramatic rulings. She was known for making sure the record was right and for not tolerating procedural games from either side. The charges carried, in aggregate, a maximum of 31 years. Melanchthon told Pruett this without particular inflection and then said that the government would almost certainly offer something eventually because they always did, and that the shape of the offer would tell them a great deal about how strong they assessed their case to be. The first offer came 8 weeks later, 12 years. Pruett rejected it. The second offer came 3 weeks after the first, 8 years with eligibility for release after 60%. Melanchthon told him it was a good offer. Pruett sat with it for 6 days. He accepted. The state charges against Camille Dupree, the fabricated possession charge, were formally dismissed 11 days after Pruett's federal arrest when the St. Mary Parish DA's office filed a nolle prosequi in district court. The dismissal did not come with a statement, an apology, or any acknowledgement of what had happened. It was a form filed in a system, a digital entry that changed a status code. Bernard Tirode filed a Section 1983 civil rights lawsuit against Pruett and the St. Mary Parish Sheriff's Office the following Monday. It named the department's failure to act on prior complaints as part of the claim. The damages sought were substantial. The case was likely to settle before trial. There was nothing glamorous about it. It was a legal proceeding, paper and procedure and time. Camille gave a deposition in the civil case 11 months later. It lasted 4 hours. She answered every question in the same measured, precise way she'd spoken in every conversation about it, not performing composure, just exercising it. At the end of the deposition, opposing counsel, a woman from Baton Rouge who had been professional and relatively decent throughout, offered her water and said she was done. Camille thanked her and started putting her notes away. She had been thinking during the deposition about a question she'd been asked in the second hour, whether, in the moment Pruett took her phone, she believed she was in danger. She had thought about it before answering. She had said, "I understood what was possible and I decided to stay focused on what was in my control." It was the most honest answer she could give. What she had not said, and what was also true, was that she had been afraid not in a sharp, immediate way, but in the specific, dull way of someone who understands a situation completely and is afraid of what that understanding means. Afraid of the bag. Afraid of the booking room. Afraid of the number 14 months. Afraid of all the invisible machinery that could, if it chose, arrange facts around a person until the facts were all that was visible. She had been afraid and she had stayed focused, and neither of those things canceled the other out. The sentencing was on a Tuesday in April. The spring had come early that year. Camp Street in New Orleans had that wet blossom smell, jasmine or something close to it, the sidewalks outside the courthouse dampened from a rain the night before. Camille was there with Bernard. She had not been required to attend, but she wanted to. The courtroom was not full. It rarely was for white-collar or misconduct sentencings, which didn't have the spectator quality of certain other cases. There were a handful of reporters. There were several people in the gallery whose connection to the proceedings was not obvious from looking at them, maybe family, maybe interested observers, maybe retired cops or other federal agents, the kind of people who followed these cases quietly and drew their own conclusions. Pruett entered from the side door with Melanchthon and a woman who was probably his daughter. She looked enough like him that it tracked, mid-20s, sitting in the first row of the gallery with the careful stillness of someone bracing against something. When Pruett walked in, he didn't scan the room. He looked at the table in front of him and he sat down and he folded his hands. Judge Tran went through the allocution proceedings. Melanchthon spoke on behalf of his client. He did not ask for sympathy exactly, more for consideration of the context of 19 years, the isolated nature of the conduct, the absence of physical violence. He was doing his job and doing it well enough. The AUSA, not Hebert, but a senior prosecutor named Costello who had handled the federal case, spoke for the government. He used the phrase abuse of public trust twice. He referenced Cortez Thibodeaux by name, noting that while Thibodeaux's case had not resulted in charges against Pruett and was not part of the current plea, the pattern it represented was relevant to the question of character and deterrence. Thibodeaux himself was not in the courtroom. Camille did not know where he was. Pruett was given the opportunity to speak. He stood and he looked at the judge and he said, "I accept responsibility for what I did. I can't explain it in a way that will make sense to anyone. I'm sorry to the court and to Ms. Dupree and to the people I served." It was not a dramatic speech. It was the speech of a man who had had several months to understand that the machinery had changed direction and that the appropriate response was to stop fighting it. There was no catharsis in it. The words were right and the voice was level and nothing in the room shifted. Judge Tran sentenced him to 7 years and 4 months in federal prison. She noted the cooperation credit. She noted the serious nature of the offense. She noted that Section 242 violations struck at the foundation of legitimate law enforcement and that the court did not take them lightly. She said all of this in a measured, deliberate tone that was neither theatrical nor cold. It took about 11 minutes. Camille watched Pruett's daughter in the gallery. The young woman had not moved. When the gavel came down, she put a hand over her mouth and then lowered it and sat straight. She was wearing a dark blue blouse and her hair was pulled back and she was very young and her face was entirely private in a way that made Camille look away. She had not come for this. She had come, she thought, because she needed the thing to have a shape, a place and a time that she could locate in memory as the place where one part of it ended and the other part began. Courts were not satisfying in the way people imagined. There was no moment of vindication. There was procedure and then the procedure concluded and the room held it for a moment, and then people started gathering their papers. She and Bernard ate lunch afterward at a place on Magazine Street. It was a Tuesday and the lunch crowd was thin. She had a shrimp paba. He had red beans and rice, the Tuesday special, which he had been ordering on Tuesdays in various New Orleans restaurants since before Camille was born. They talked about the civil case's progress. They talked about a deposition in a completely different matter that was scheduled for the following week. They talked about whether the city was going to do anything about the pothole situation on the I-10 ramp, which had been catastrophic for at least 3 months. He paid the check. They walked back to his car, which was parked 2 blocks away. On the way they passed a woman pushing a stroller, 2 men eating from takeout containers on a stoop, a kid on a bicycle with something blasting from a small Bluetooth speaker attached to the handlebars, something fast and bright that was gone before you could name it. The drive back to St. Mary Parish was mostly quiet. Bernard put on a jazz station out of New Orleans that faded into static around Thibodaux and he turned it off. The late afternoon light was doing something soft and specific to the rice fields on either side of the road, turning them gold or something adjacent to gold, the color that comes in the hour before dark when the angle is right. Egrets were working the flooded paddies, white and unhurried. Camille watched them out the window. She thought about Parish Road 14 and the smell of standing water and cut cane, and the spotlight hitting her mirror, and the careful particular way she had placed her hands at 10 and 2. She thought about the Cessna making its slow circles at 2,000 feet with its cameras pointed at the dark earth below looking for one thing and finding another. She thought about how much had turned on the fact that someone had simply been watching. Not watching her, just watching. Just doing the work of watching, that night in that place in that direction. The egrets didn't move when the car passed. They stood in the silver water and worked, unhurried in the fading light. And